Chapter 6. Jacob's Fight with the Angel. What I learned about Abraxas from the eccentric musician Pistorius I cannot relate briefly, but the most important thing I learned from him was a further step on the path to myself. Around 18 at that time, I was an unusual young person, precocious in 100 ways but very undeveloped and helpless in 100 others. When I had occasionally compared myself with others, I had often been proud and smug, but just as often depressed and humiliated. I had often thought of myself as a genius, often as half crazy. I couldn't manage to share in the joys and activities of those my age, and I had often been consumed with self reproaches and worries, as if I were hopelessly cut off from them, as if I were shut off from life. Pistorius, who was a full-fledged eccentric himself, taught me to keep up my courage and self-respect, but constantly finding something of value in my words, dreams, fantasies, and ideas by constantly taking them seriously and discussing them earnestly. He set me an example. You told me, he said, that you love music because it's not moralistic or right. But you learn yourself must not be a moralist either. You shouldn't compare yourself with others, and if nature has made you a bat, you shouldn't try to turn yourself into an ostrich. You sometimes think you are peculiar. You reproach yourself for going other ways than most people. You have got to get out of that head. Look into the fire, look into the clouds, and as soon as your presentiment comes and the voices in your soul begin to speak, surrender yourself to them and don't start off by asking God whether that suits you or pleases your teacher, your father, or some God or other. If you do that, you will ruin yourself. That way, you get on the sidewalk and you become a fossil. My friend Sinclair, our God is named Abraxas. He is God and Satan. Both the bright world and the dark world are contained in him. Abraxas has no objections to any of your thoughts or any of your dreams. Never forget that. But he will abandon you if you ever become faultless and normal. Then he will abandon you and look for a new pot to cook his ideas in. Among all my dreams, that obscure dream of love was the most loyal. I dreamt it over and over again. I walked beneath the heraldic bird in our house. I wanted to draw my mother to my bosom, and in her place I embraced the tall woman who was half masculine and half maternal. I was afraid of her, and yet I was drawn to her by the most burning desire, and I could never tell my friend that dream. I held it back after revealing everything else to him. It was my cranny, my secret, my refuge. Whenever I was downcast, I asked Pistorius to play that Passacaglia by the old master Buxtehude. Then I sat in the dark church in the evening, lost in that strange, intimate music which seemed to me submerged in itself, to be listening to itself. Each time it soothed me and left me better prepared to acknowledge the voices in my soul. Sometimes we remained seated in the church for a while after the organ tones had already died away, and we saw the dim light shine through the tall Gothic arch of the window and become lost in the darkness. It sounds funny, Pistorius said, that I was once a divinity student and almost become a person. But the error then I made was merely from one of form. To be a priest is my vocation and my goal, but I became satisfied too soon, placing myself at Jehovah's disposal even before I knew Abraxas. Every religion is beautiful. Religion is soul. Whether you take a communion as a Christian or you make a pilgrimage to Mecca. In that case, I said, you might just as well have become a person. No, Sinclair, no. I would have had to lie. Our religion is practiced as if it weren't one. It behaves as if it were entirely rational. In a pinch, I could be Catholic, but a Protestant clergyman. No, the handful of true believers I know some abide by the literal meaning. I couldn't tell them, for example, that for me, Christ is not an individual, but the hero, a myth, an enormous shadow in which mankind seeks his own image cast into the wall of eternity. and the rest. Those who could come to church to hear a wise saying, to fulfill a duty, to avoid being negligent, and so on. What was I supposed to tell them? Was I to convert them, you think? But I don't want to. A priest isn't out for conversions. He wants to live only among believers, people like himself. He wants to be a bearer and the spokesman of the emotion out of which we create our gods. He broke off. Then he continued. A new faith for which we now choose Abraxas' name is beautiful, my friends. It's the best thing we have, but it's still in its infancy. Its wings haven't grown yet. A solitary religion is not yet truth. It has to become the religion of the community. It must have rites and frenzy, festivals and mysteries. He sank into meditation. Can't mysteries also be created by one person or a very small circle? I asked hesitantly. Yes, they can, he said, nodding his head. I have been celebrating them for some time. I have performed rites for which I would have to go to prison for years if people knew about them. But I know I'm still not the real thing. Suddenly he slapped me on the shoulder, making me start. My boy, he said forcefully, you too have mysteries. I know you must have dreams you don't tell me about. Don't want to know them, but I tell you, live out those dreams, play out your role in them, build altars to them. They still won't be perfect, but it's a way. It remains to be seen whether we, you and I, and a few others will renew the world. But within ourselves, we must renew it daily. Otherwise, we are meaningless. Think it over. You are 18 years old, Sinclair. You don't chase after street walkers. You must have dreams of love, wishes for love. Perhaps they are of such a kind that you are afraid of them. Don't be afraid. They are the best thing you have. You can believe me. I lost a lot by doing violence to my dreams of love when I was your age. No one should do that. If a person knows about Abraxas, he must no longer do that. He should be afraid of nothing and consider nothing taboo that the soul within us desires. I was frightened and objected, but a person can't just do everything that comes into his head. For instance, you must not kill someone because you can't stand him. He moved closer to me. Under certain circumstances, you can even do that. Only it's usually a mistake, and I don't mean you should simply do anything that comes to mind. No, but those ideas, which make some good sense, shouldn't be made harmful by chasing them away and moralizing about them. Instead of crucifying yourself or anyone else, you can drink wine from a chalice with solemn thoughts and convince of that as the mystery of sacrifice while you are doing it. Even without such formal proceedings, you can treat your urges and so called evil temptations with respect and love. Then to show their true sense and to all make sense. Whenever you next time get some really bad or sinful idea, Sinclair, when you feel like killing someone or committing some terrifically obscene act, then remember for a moment that it's Abraxas who is imagining that in your mind. The person you would like to kill is never Mr. So and so. He's definitely just a disguise. When we hate a person, what we hate in his image is something inside ourselves. Whatever isn't inside us can't excite us. Pistorius had never told me anything that affected me so deeply in my inmost recesses. I was unable to reply, but the thing that had touched me most powerfully and oddly was the resemblance between that exhortation and speeches by Demian, which had stayed with me for years and years. They didn't know about each other, yet they were both telling me the same thing. The things we see, Pistorius said quietly, are the same things that are in us. The only reality is the one we have in us. That's why most people's life are so unreal because they consider the external images to be real and don't allow their own world within themselves to tell them anything. They can be happy that way, but when a person once knows the other way, he is no longer free to choose the path that must people follow. Sinclair, the path of the majority is easy. Ours is hard. Let's go. A few days later, after I had waited for him in the vain twice, I came across him in the street late one evening, blown around a corner in the cold night wind, alone, stumbling and bestowed with drink. I didn't want to call him. He walked past me without seeing me. He was straight ahead with burning, lonely eyes, as if following an obscure call from unknown. I followed him for the length of a street. He drifted along as if pulled by an invisible string, his pace fanatical but weak and confused, like a ghost. Suddenly, I returned home, back to my unfulfilled dreams. That's how he is renewing the world in himself, I thought. And yet, at the same moment, I felt that it was a cheap, moralistic thought. What did I know of his dreams? Perhaps in his intoxication, he was treading a similar path that I was in my anxiety. In the breaks between lessons, I had sometimes become aware that a classmate, to whom I had never paid attention, was trying to approach me. He was a short, weak looking, skinny boy with thin, reddish blonde hair, with something all his own in his gaze and his behavior. One evening, as I arrived home, he was waiting in the street for me. He let me pass by him, then ran after me and stopped in front of my door. Do you want something from me? I asked. I just want to talk with you, he said timidly. Please walk a bit with me. I followed him and noticed that he was extremely agitated and filled with expectancy. His hands were trembling. Are you a spiritualistic? He asked suddenly. No, Connor, I said with a laugh. No way. What put that you in your head? But are you a theosophist? Again, no. Oh, don't be so secretive. I can tell very well there's something special about you in your eyes. I firmly believe you consort with spirits. I'm not asking out of idly curiosity. Sinclair, oh no, I myself I'm a seeker, you know, and I'm so alone. Out with it, I said encouragingly. I don't know anything about spirits, of course. I live in my dreams, and that's what caught your attention. The people live in dreams too, but not in their own. That's the difference. Yes, maybe so, he whispered. But what counts is the kind of dream a person is living in. Have you ever heard of white magic? I had to say no. It's when you learn to control your own powers, you can become immortal and also cast spells. Haven't you ever indulged in such practices? When I asked with curiosity what those practices were, he acted mysterious at first until I turned to go, then he came out with it. For example, if I want to fall asleep or concentrate, I do the following exercise. I think for something, for example, a word or a name or a geometric figure. I impress it into my mind as hard as I can. I try to picture it in my head until I feel it's in there. Then I imagine it by going down to my neck and so on until I'm entirely filled with it. Then I'm completely firm and nothing can disturb my repose anymore. I grasped his meaning to a degree, but I felt that he still had something else on his mind. He was oddly excited and hasty. I tried to make it easy for him to question me, and before long he revealed what he was really after. You practice strong continence too, don't you? He asked me anxiously. How do you mean? You mean dash? Yes, yes. For 2 years I have been continent ever since learning about the doctrine. Before that I used to commit a vice. You know which one. And so you have never been with a woman. No, I said, I have never found the right one. But if you did find the right one you thought is right, would you? But, yes, naturally. If she had no objection, I said, a little sarcastically. Oh, then you are on the wrong path. You can develop only your inner powers if you remain perfectly continent. I have done it for 2 years. 2 years and a little over a month. It's so hard. Sometimes I can barely stand it any longer. Listen, Connor. I don't believe continence is also fired important. I know, he said defensively. That's what everyone says, but I didn't expect it from you. Whoever wants to travel the higher mental path must remain pure, absolutely. Well, do it, but I don't understand why someone is more pure when he suppresses his dash urges than anyone else's. Or are you able to eliminate dash from all your thoughts and dreams as well? He looked at me in despair. No, that's just it. My God, and I have to. At night I had dreams I can't even repeat to myself. Terrible dreams, you hear? I recall what Pistorius had told me, but correct as I found his words to be, I couldn't pass them along. I couldn't give advice that didn't stem from my own experience, advice that I didn't yet feel myself capable of following. I became taciturn and felt humiliated because someone was seeking advice from me and I had none to give. I have tried everything, Connor was lamenting as he stood there beside me. I have done all that can be done with cold water, with snow, with gymnastics and running, but nothing helps. Every night I wake up from dreams that are unthinkable, and the horrible thing is, what that happens, I gradually lose again everything I learned mentally. But now I can barely manage to concentrate or put myself to sleep. Often I lie awake all night long. I won't be able to go on like this much longer. If I finally can't fight the battle to the end, if I give in and make myself impure again, then I'm worse than all the rest, those who never fought at all. You understand that, don't you? I nodded but couldn't add any words. He was beginning to bore me, and I was frightened in myself, seeing that his obvious distress and despair made no stronger impression on me. All I felt was, I can't help you. So there's nothing you can tell me, he finally said, exhausted and sad. Nothing at all. There just has to be a way. How do you manage it? I can't tell you anything, Connor. In such matters, people can't help each other. No one helped me either. You have to meditate on your own needs, and then must do whatever is in accord with your real own nature. Nothing else will help. If you can't find yourself, you won't find any spirits either. That's what I think. Disappointed and suddenly struck dumb, the little fellow looked at me, then a sudden malice blazed up in his eyes. He made a face at me and yelled furiously, "Oh, you're a fine saint, aren't you? You have got your vice too. I know you act like a philosopher, but secretly you are hung up on the same fell that I am. Everybody is. You are a pig, just like me. We are all pigs." I went away and left him standing there. He took 2 or 3 paces after me, then he hung back, turned around, and ran away. I was sick with a feeling of sympathy and revulsion, and I couldn't get rid of that feeling until I was back in my little room and had arranged my handful of pictures around me, surrendering to my own dreams with the most ardent warmth. Then my dream immediately recurred, about my doorway and its coat of arms, about my mother and the woman I didn't know. I saw the woman's features with such severe clarity that on the very evening I began to draw her picture. When the drawing was finished, a few days later, traced onto the paper in dreamlike 15 minutes stints, as if unconsciously, I hung it up on my wall in the evening, moved my reading lamp in front of it, and stood before it as if facing a spirit with whom I had to fight until a decision was reached. It was a face resembling the earlier one, resembling my friend Timian, but in some features resembling me as well. One eye was noticeably higher than the other. The direction of their gaze passed over and beyond me in the rigidity of concentration filled with destiny. I stood before it and turned cold to the heart from inner exertion. I questioned the picture. I made accusations against it. I caressed it. I prayed to it. I called it mother. I called it beloved. I called it foe and prologue. I called it abraxas. Meanwhile, things as Pistorius, or was it Timian, had told me came to mind. I couldn't recall when they had been said, but I thought I was hearing them again. They concerned Jacob's fight with the angel of God and Jacob's word. I will not let you go unless you bless me. The painted face in the lamplight changed each time I invoked it. It became bright and radiant, it became dark and gloomy. Its pallid eyelids fell, covering raised eyes, or opened again with the eyes flashed and gleamed. It was a woman, man, a girl, a little child, an animal. It dissolved into a blood, then grew large and clear again. Finally, obeying a strong inner call, I closed my eyes and now saw the image inside me, stronger and more powerful. I wanted to kneel down before it, but it was so firmly inside me that I could no longer separate it from myself, as if it had become my pure ego. Then I heard a heavy, muffled roll, like that of a spring storm, and I trembled with an indescribably new feeling of anxiety and experience. Stars flared up and went out before my eyes, memories reaching back to my earliest, most completely forgotten childhood, and even back to prior existence and early stages of evolution flowed past me in throngs. But the memories, which seemed to be repeating my whole life and penetrating its deepest secrets, didn't stop at yesterday and today. They were farther, mirroring the picture, tearing me away from today and into new life forms whose images were bright and dazzling, but none of which I was later able to recall clearly. During the night, I awoke from a deep sleep. I was dressed, stretched out across the bed. I turned on the right lighting with the feeling that I must remember something important. I recalled nothing of the previous hours. I turned on the light. My memory came back gradually. I looked for the picture. It was no longer hanging on the wall, but wasn't on the table either. Then I thought I could have dimly recalled having burned it, or I merely dreamt about burning it while holding it and then eating the ashes. I was driven by a great pulsating unrest. I put on my hat, walked through the house onto the street as if by compulsion. I walked on and on through streets and across squares as if blown onward by a storm. Stopped to listen in front of my friend's church, now dark, sought and sought, not knowing what. In the obscurity of my impulse, I walked through a suburban of Bordellos where some lights were still burning here and there. Farther out, there were construction sites and piles of brick practically covered with grey snow. As I drifted through that wilderness like a sleepwalker propelled by an unknown force, I recalled a construction site in my hometown into which my tormentor Cromer had once pulled me for our first settlement of accounts. A similar site was located here in front of me in the grey night. The blackness of its empty doorway gaped at me. I felt drawn inside. I wanted to resist and I stumbled over sand and rubbish. The urge was stronger. I had to go in. Over boards and shattered bricks, I reeled into the deserted space which had a dismal smell of damp coal and stones. A heap of sand there from the patch of light grey. Aside from that, everything was dark. Then a horrified voice called me. For God's sake, Sinclair, where did you come from? And beside me a person loomed out of the darkness, a short, thin yellow fellow, like a spirit, and while my hair was still standing on end, I recognized my classmate Connor. How did you get here? He asked, as if mad with excitement. How could you find me? I didn't understand. I wasn't looking for you, I said, stupefied. Every word was an effort for me, painfully passing my dead, heavy, seemingly frozen lips. He stared at me. Weren't looking? No, I felt drawn here. Did you call me? You must have called me. What are you doing here? It's the middle of the night. He convulsively threw his skinny arms around me. Yes, night, morning must be coming soon. Oh, Sinclair, you didn't forget me. How can you forgive me? For what? Oh, I was so hateful, you know. It was only then I remembered our conversation. Had then been 4 or 5 days earlier, I felt as if a lifetime had gone by since then. But now I suddenly knew everything, not only what had passed between us, but also why had I had to come here and what Connor had intended to do out there. So you wanted to take your life, Connor? He shivered with cold and fear. Yes, I did. I don't know whether I could have done it. I wanted to wait until morning. I led him out into the open. The first horizontal rays of daylight were shining, indescribably cold and listless, in the grey sky. I led the boy by the arm for a stretch. A voice came from me saying, now you are going home and you won't say a thing to anyone. You have been following the wrong path. And we are not pigs as you think. We are human beings. We create gods and fight with them, and they bless us. We continued walking in silence, then separated. When I got home, it was daylight. The best thing those days in state dash still had in store for me was the hours I spent with Pistorius at the organ or in the front of the fireplace. Together we read a Greek text about Abraxas. He read aloud to me portions of translations of the Vedas and taught me how to pronounce the sacred symbol O. Yet it wasn't those scholarly accomplishments that fostered my inner self. Rather, it was just the opposite. What benefited me was my further progress in finding myself, my increasing confidence in my own dreams, ideas, and presentiments, and my increasing knowledge of the power I carried inside me. I got along with Pistorius in every way. All I needed was to think about him hard, and I could be sure of a visit or a message from him, just as the case had been with Timian. I could ask him something even if it wasn't present. I just had to imagine him clearly and address my questions to him in the form of intensive thoughts. Then all the physic force I had expended on the question flowed back to me as the reply. Only it wasn't the person of Pistorius that I imagined or that of Maximian. It was the picture I had dreamed and painted, the androgynous dream image of my daemon that I had to invoke. Now it no longer lived merrily in my dreams or painted on paper, but inside me as an ideal and a heightening of myself. The relationship I had now formed with the fair suicide corner was peculiar and sometimes funny. Since that night in which I had been sent to him, he was devoted to me like a loyal servant or a dog. He tried to link his life to mine and he followed me blindly. He came to me with the oddest questions and wishes. He wanted to see spirits and learn Kabbalah, and he didn't believe me when I assured him that I knew nothing of all those matters. He thought I possessed every kind of power, but the strange thing was that often he came to me with his odd, stupid questions precisely when there was a knot in me that had to be untied, and his whimsical notions and requests often supplied me with the clue and the impetus for untying the knot. Often I lost patience with him and dismissed him imperiously, but I nevertheless perceived this. He, too, was sent to me. Even from him I got back twofold everything I gave him. He, too, was a guide for me, or rather a path. The crazy books and articles which he bought me, and in which he was seeking his salvation, taught me more than I could discern at the moment. Later on, this corner disappeared from my path without my being aware of it. A decisive confrontation with him wasn't necessary, but with Pistorius it was. Toward the end of my school days in State Dash, I had another peculiar experience with that friend. Even innocuous people are hardly spared from coming into conflict one time or more in their life with the lovely virtues of piety and gratitude. Everyone must at some time take the step that separates him from his father, from his teachers. Everyone must taste a little of the toughness of solitude, even though most people can't stand much of it and soon knuckle under again. I hadn't parted from my parents and their world, the bright world of my beautiful childhood, in a violent battle, but I had grown more distant from them and more of a stranger to them, slowly and almost imperceptibly. I was sorry about it. When I visited them back home, it was often created bitter hours for me, but it did not affect me in my vitals. It was bearable. But in situations where we have made the gift of our love and penetration not our not out of long familiarity but out of our most personal impulses, where we have been disciplines and friends from the depth of our heart. In such cases, it's a bitter and frightening moment when we suddenly seem to realize that a principal current within us is determined to carry us away from the person we love. Then every thought that rejects our friendship and teacher turns its poison barb against our own bosom, then each defensive blow we strike hits our own face. Then anyone who imagined he was harboring a valid morality in his heart feels the words disloyalty and ingratitude looming up like catcalls and stigmas. Then one's frightened heart flees fearfully back to the cherished berries of childhood virtues and can't believe that this break, too, must be made, then this bond, too, must be severed. Slowly, in the course of time, a feeling inside me had come to oppose my unconditional acceptance of my friend Pistorius as a guide. My friendship with him, his advice, his consolation, his proximity were what I had experienced in the most important month of my life as a young man. God had spoken to me through him. From his lips, my dreams had come back to me, explained and interpreted. He had bestowed on me the courage to find myself, and now, oh, I gradually felt increasing resistance to him. I heard too much in his words of an instructive nature. I felt that he had a firm understanding of one part of me only. There was no argument or scene between us, no break or not even a squaring of accounts. I merely spoke a single, actually harmless phrase to him, but nevertheless, at that very moment, an illusion we had shared was shattered into multicolored shards. For some time, the foreboding had oppressed me. It became a distinct feeling one Sunday in his old scholarly room. We were lying on the floor in front of the fire, and he was speaking about mystery cults and religious forms that was he was studying and meditating on, and whose possible future occupied his thoughts. But to tell me all that seemed more of an interesting curiosity than something significant for one's life. I heard it in scholarship, I heard it in wearily search amid the ruins of worlds gone by. And all at once I felt repelled by this whole genre, by this cult of mythologies, by this jigsaw puzzle of handed own forms of faith. Pistorius, I suddenly said, with a malice that surprised even me as it was forth terrifyingly. You ought to tell me a dream again sometime, a real dream you had at night. What you are saying now is so damned antiquarian. He had never heard me talk like that, and at the very moment I myself realized in a flash with shame and fright that the arrow I had shot at him, striking him to the heart, had been taken from his own arsenal, that I had now maliciously hurled at him at a more pointed form of his own self reproaches, which I had occasionally heard him utter ironically. I felt it at once, and fell silent that very moment. I looked at him with fear in my heart, and I saw him turn frightfully pale. After a long, difficult pause, he placed fresh wood on the fire and said quietly, "You are quite right, Sinclair. You are a bright fellow. I will spare you the antiquarian stuff." He was speaking very calmly, but I could detect the pain of his injury. What had I done? I was close to tears. I wanted to turn to him cordially. I wanted to ask his forgiveness, to assure him of my love, my tender gratitude. I thought of some touching words, but I couldn't utter them. I remained lying there, looking into the fire in silence, and he was silent too. And so we lay there, and the fire burned down and collapsed. And as each yelping flame died away, I felt something beautiful and intimate dimming and scattering like sparks, with no possibility of return. "I'm afraid you have misunderstood me," I finally said in a very strained way and in a dry, hoarse voice. The stupid, meaningless words passed my lips as if mechanically, as if I were reading aloud from a serialized novel in a newspaper. "I understand you perfectly well," said Pistorius quietly, "and you are right." He paused. Then he continued slowly. "As far as any person can be regard to someone else. No, no," a voice in me called. "I'm wrong," but I couldn't say a thing. I knew that my single brief phrase had pointed out to him an essential weakness, his distress and want. I had touched on the spot where he had to distrust himself. His ideal was antiquarian. He was a seeker into the past. He was romantic. And suddenly I felt deep down precisely what Pistorius had been to me and had been to me. He couldn't be to himself and give himself. He had led me along a path that had to go beyond even him, the guide, and leave him behind. Only God knows how a person comes to say such things. I hadn't meant it unkindly. I hadn't had any foreboding of a catastrophe. I had uttered something that at the moment of utterance I myself wasn't at all aware of. I had yielded to the temptation of a small remark, a little humorous, a little malicious, and it had turned into something fateful. I had committed a small, thoughtless act of rudeness, and for him it had become a judgment. Oh, how I wished at the time that he would get angry, defend himself, yell at me. He did none of that. I had to do it all myself in my own mind. He would have smiled if he had been able to. His inability to do so showed me most clearly how deeply I had hurt him, and by accepting so silently the blow that I, his impudent and ungrateful pupil, had dealt him, by remaining silent and indicating that I was in the right, by acknowledging my words to be the voice of faith, Pistorius made me hate myself. He made my thoughtlessness a thousand times worse. When I struck, I thought I was hitting a strong man capable of defending himself, but it was quite suffering man unarmed who surrendered in silence. For quite a while we remained lying in front of the dying fire, in which every glowing figure, every curling rod of ashes reminded me of happy, beautiful, rich hours and increased more and more my debt of obligation to Pistorius. Finally, I could no longer stand it. I got up and left. For some time, I stood in front of the door in his room. For some time, on the dark stairs. For some time, even in front of the house, waiting for him to come and follow me. Then I proceeded onward, walking for hours and hours through the town and its suburbs, park and forest, until evening. And then, for the first time, I felt the mark of Cain on my forehead. Only gradually did I begin reflecting on what had happened. All my thoughts had the intention of accusing myself and defending Pistorius, and they all ended with the opposite. 1,000 times I was ready to regret my hasty words and take them back, but they had nevertheless been true. It was only then that I succeeded in understanding Pistorius, in constructing his entire dream before my eyes. That dream had been through a priest, to proclaim the new religion, to offer new forms of edification, love, and worship, to set up new symbols. But that was beyond his powers. It wasn't his office. He dwelt too lovingly on the past. His knowledge of what had once occurred was too precise. He knew too much about Egypt, India, Mithra, Abraxas. His love was attached to images that the world had already seen, and at the same time he surely knew in his mind that those new things had to be new and different, that they must gush up out of fresh soil and not be drawn from collections and libraries as if from some old well. His office, perhaps, was to help guide people to themselves, as he had done for me. To give them something altogether novel, their new gods, was not his office. And at that point, the realization suddenly burned me like a searing flame. For each person, there was an office, but for nobody was there one that he was permitted to choose for himself, to define, and to fill according to his own wishes. It was wrong to desire new gods. It was totally wrong to try and give the world anything. There was no duty for enlightened people, none except this: to seek themselves, to become certain of themselves, to grow forward along their own path, wherever it might lead. I was deeply affected by that, and for me, that was the profit from that experience. I have often played with images of the future. I had dreamed of roles that might be meant for me, as a poet, perhaps, or as a prophet, or as a painter, or whatever else. That was all meaningless. I didn't exist to write poetry, to preach sermons, to paint pictures. Neither I nor anyone else existed for that purpose. All of that merely happened to a person along the way. Everyone had only one true vocation: to find himself. Let him wind up as a poet or a madman, as a prophet or a criminal. That wasn't his business. In the long run, it was irrelevant. His business was to discover his own destiny, not just any destiny, and to live it totally and undividedly. Anything else was just a half measure, an attempt to run away, an escape back to the ideal of the masses, an adaptation, fear of one's own nature. Fearsome and sacred, the new things rose up before me. I had sensed it 100 times, perhaps I had already enunciated it, but now I was experiencing it for the first time. I was a gamble of nature, a throw of the dice into an uncertain realm, leading perhaps to something new, perhaps to nothing, and to let this throw away from the primordial depths take effect, to fill it will inside myself and adopt it completely as my own will. That alone was my vocation, that alone. I had already experienced plenty of loneliness. Now I sensed that even deeper loneliness existed, and it was there, inescapable. I made no attempt to patch things up with Pistorius. We remained friends, but our relationship had changed. Once only did we speak about it actually, and it was only he that did so. He said, I have the desire to become a priest, as you know. I wanted most of all to become the priest of the new religion that we have so many presentiments of. I will never be able to. I know that, and I have known it for a long time, though I never fully admitted it to myself. Well, I will perform other priestly duties, perhaps as an organist, perhaps in other ways. But I must always be surrounded by something I feel to be beautiful and holy. Organ music and mystery cult, symbol and myth. I need it and I won't give it up. That's my weakness. Because I know at times, Sinclair, I know sometimes that I shouldn't have such desires, but they represent a luxury and weakness. It would be grander, it would be more proper if I quite simply placed myself at the disposal of fate, making no claims. But I can't. It's the only thing I can't do. Maybe you will be able to someday. It's difficult, it's the only really difficult thing that exists. My young friend, I have often dreamt of it, but I can't do it. It terrifies me. I can't stand there so completely naked and alone. I, too, am a poor, weak dog that needs a little warmth and food and would occasionally like to feel the nearness of his own kind. The person who truly wants nothing except his destiny no longer has others of his own kind. He stands completely alone and has only the chill of outer space around him. You know, that's Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. There have been many martyrs who gladly let themselves be crucified, but even they were no heroes and weren't liberated. Even they wanted something that they had come to love, that was familiar to them from home. They had models to follow, they had ideals. The person who desires nothing else but destiny no longer has models or ideals, nothing dear to him, nothing to console him, and that is the right path to follow. People like you and me are really lonely, it's true, but we still have one another. We have the secret satisfaction of being different, of reveling, of desiring the unusual. That too must fall by the wayside if a person wants to follow the path to its end. He must not even desire to be revolutionary, a model, a role model, or a martyr is beyond imagining. Yes, it was beyond imagining. But it could be dreamed, it could be anticipated, it could be sensed. A few times I had an inkling of it when I found an hour of complete calm. Then I looked myself into the wide open eyes of my faithful image. They could be full of wisdom, they could be full of madness, they could radiate love or deep malice. It made no difference. A person wasn't allowed to choose any of that. He wasn't allowed to want anything. He was only allowed to want himself, his own destiny. Pistorius had served me as a guide for the stretch of the path that led up to that point. In those days, I ran around like a blind man. A storm roared in me. Every step I took spelled danger. I saw nothing but the precipitous darkness in front of me, in which all paths I had previously taken penetrated out and submerged. And in my mind I saw the image of the guide who resembled Damien and in whose eyes my destiny lay. I wrote on a piece of paper, one guide has left me. I'm completely in the dark. I can't take a step by myself. Help me. I wanted to send it to Jimian, but I didn't. Every time I wanted to, it looked silly and pointless. But I knew that before brief prayer by heart and often recited it to myself. It accompanied me at all times. I began to sense the meaning of prayer. My years of secondary school were over. I was to take a trip during summer vacation. My father had come up with the idea, and then I was to go to the university. To which faculty I didn't know. I was granted a semester in the philosophy faculty. I would have been just as contented with any another.